Picture this. A boy stands alone at the edge of a training ground, watching the sun dip behind the Hokage monument, and not one person in the entire village of Konoha has any idea what's about to change forever. Not the villagers walking home with their grocery bags. Not the shinobi patrolling the walls. Not even the boy himself. If you've ever felt like the world had already decided what you were worth before you got the chance to prove otherwise, stick around. Because this is the story of Naruto Uzumaki, the loudest, most obnoxious, most hopeless ninja in his entire graduating class, and the buried secret inside him that was about to rewrite everything Konoha thought it knew about greatness. Welcome back, and if this is your first time joining us, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this ride is just getting started. The academy courtyard was packed that morning, parents and siblings crowding along the fence to watch their kids take the final step toward becoming real ninja. Flowers had been picked. Photographs were being planned. Somewhere in the crowd, the Nara clan and the Akimichi clan were already trading lazy jokes about which of their kids would embarrass the other first. Naruto Uzumaki stood off to the side, alone, the way he always did. He wasn't unnoticed because he was quiet. If anything, Naruto was the opposite of quiet, loud declarations, exaggerated promises about becoming Hokage someday, pranks that had half the academy staff exhausted before 10 in the morning. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being seen constantly and understood never, and that was the loneliness Naruto wore like a second skin. No parents in the crowd for him. No proud family photograph. Just a boy in an orange jumpsuit that practically glowed against the muted village colors, standing with his arms crossed, pretending the empty space beside him didn't matter. Next. Uzumaki, Naruto. Iruka's voice echoed through the exam room. And if you'd been sitting in that room, you would have felt the temperature drop about 10 degrees. Whispers rippled through the remaining students waiting their turn. A few smirked. One or two looked almost sorry for him. Almost. This should be good, a boy near the back muttered to his friend, not troubling himself to lower his voice. Bet you 5 Rio he fails again. I'm not betting against a guaranteed win, his friend replied, and they both snickered. Naruto heard every word. Of course he did. He always heard every word. That was the cruel joke of being the class dead last. Everyone assumed that because he was bad at ninjutsu, he must also be too dense to notice the way people talked about him. He wasn't. He noticed everything. He just never let it show on his face, because showing it would have meant admitting it hurt. He walked into the exam room with his usual crooked grin plastered on, like armor. Mizuki was seated beside Iruka at the long instructor's table, arms folded, an unreadable look on his face. Iruka, for his part, offered Naruto the smallest, most private nod of encouragement, the kind of gesture that told you this wasn't just a teacher watching a student. This was somebody who actually wanted him to succeed. Whenever you're ready, Naruto, Iruka said. The exam was simple on paper. Perform the transformation jutsu. Perform a basic substitution. And finally, the one that had haunted Naruto through 2 prior graduation attempts. Perform 3 clean shadow clones. He nailed the transformation without trouble. He'd practiced that one to death out of sheer spite after failing it the first time. The substitution went fine too, quick and clean, drawing the faintest surprised eyebrow raise from Mizuki. Then came the clones. Naruto's hands formed the seal. He could feel it already, that same maddening resistance in his own chakra, like trying to pour water into a cup that kept shrinking every time he got close. He'd trained on this exact jutsu for nights on end, sneaking into empty training grounds long after the other students had gone home to warm dinners and warm beds. And every single time, the same thing happened. The clone that stumbled out of the smoke wasn't a clone at all. It was a pale, sickly, half-formed thing, collapsed on its side, twitching weakly like a candle guttering out. The room didn't even need to say anything. The silence did it for them. I'm sorry, Naruto, Iruka said quietly, and for once there was no scolding in his voice, only genuine regret. You fail. Mizuki's expression didn't change. If you'd been watching closely, and later some people would wish they had been, you might have caught the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. Not disappointment, something closer to satisfaction. Have you ever had one of those days where failure doesn't just sting, it seems to follow you home? Naruto sat alone on the school swing that evening, watching families walk by with their fresh headband-wearing graduates, watching fathers hoist their kids onto their shoulders, watching mothers straighten their children's new forehead protectors with proud, careful hands. Every single person who passed him seemed to make a point of not looking at him, which somehow felt worse than being stared at. Failed again, huh? Naruto didn't need to turn around to know it was Mizuki. He'd half expected someone to come find him. Iruka usually did, in his own gruff way. But he hadn't expected Mizuki. Yeah, Naruto muttered, kicking at the dirt beneath the swing. Guess I really am hopeless. You know, Mizuki said, crouching down so he was eye level with him, voice gentle in a way that should have set off alarm bells but didn't. There's actually a way you could graduate tonight. A special, secret test. Iruka doesn't know about it. It's not something he's allowed to tell anyone unless he thinks they're ready. If you already know how this part of the story goes, you know exactly what's coming. But imagine being Naruto in that moment. 12 years old, starving for even a scrap of belief from somebody, anybody. Of course he leaned in. Of course he believed him. There's a scroll, Mizuki continued, lowering his voice like he was letting Naruto in on the greatest secret in the world, locked in the Hokage's private vault. If you can sneak it out, learn one technique from it, and bring it to me out in the forest tonight, I'll make sure you pass. Better than pass. I'll make sure everyone knows just how strong you really are. Somewhere in Konoha that night, an old man was about to feel his stomach drop the moment he discovered his most dangerous scroll was missing. But Naruto didn't know that yet. All he knew was that somebody, for once, had told him he could be something more than a punchline. He said yes. The theft itself went off without a hitch, which, frankly, should have been Naruto's first clue that something was deeply wrong, because Naruto Uzumaki had never once in his life pulled off a stealth mission without chaos. But adrenaline and hope have a funny way of sharpening a person's focus, and by the time the moon was high over the forest outside the village, Naruto had the massive scroll unrolled across the ground of a small clearing, sweat dripping down his face as he pored over its contents by torchlight. The first jutsu listed was the shadow clone technique, the very one that had failed him that morning, over and over. Only this version wasn't the Academy's simplified variant. This was the real thing, an S-rank technique capable of creating fully functional, corporeal clones limited only by the user's chakra reserves. Okay, Naruto muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow. Okay, I can do this. He tried. He failed. He tried again. Somewhere around the fourth or fifth attempt, sprawled on the forest floor, gasping, something strange happened, something Naruto himself barely registered in the moment, distracted as he was by frustration. For just an instant, as his chakra flared out wildly beyond his control, the grass beneath his palms seemed to shiver. A few blades grew a fraction taller, faster than any grass should grow. He didn't notice. He was already back on his feet, forming the seal again. By his 20th attempt, something shifted. The clone that popped into existence beside him wasn't pale and sickly. It was solid. Real. Breathing. I did it, Naruto whispered, staring at his own perfect reflection standing beside him. I actually did it. That's when Iruka found him. If you've been enjoying this story so far, now's a great time to hit that like button, because what happens next is the moment everything changes. Not just for Naruto, but for the entire village, whether they realize it yet or not. Iruka burst into the clearing, chest heaving from the run, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fury. Naruto! What in the world are you doing out here with that? Iruka-sensei. Naruto beamed, entirely misreading the situation, holding up the enormous scroll like a trophy. I did it. I learned a technique from the scroll, a real one. Mizuki-sensei said if I could learn something from it, I'd pass. Something flickered across Iruka's face, confusion, quickly curdling into dawning horror. Mizuki told you that? Before Naruto could answer, a whistle of displaced air cut through the clearing, and Iruka's body moved on pure instinct, shoving Naruto aside and taking the blow himself. A set of large shuriken embedding themselves across his back with a sickening series of thuds. Sensei! Mizuki dropped down from the tree line, a massive shuriken slung across his back, his usual mild-mannered instructor's demeanor completely gone, replaced by something colder and hungrier. Well, look who found the little thief before I could clean this up quietly. Mizuki, Irika gasped, blood soaking through the back of his uniform. Don't do this. Do what, Irika? Take back what should have been mine years ago. Mizuki's eyes slid past his bleeding colleague, landing on Naruto with a look of pure contempt. Naruto, give me the scroll, and I'll even let you live. Consider that generous, given what you are. Naruto's grip tightened on the scroll, confusion and fear warring across his face. What I am? What are you talking about? You really don't know, do you? Mizuki laughed, and there was nothing kind left in the sound at all. 12 years, and nobody's told you the truth. Fine. Let me be the one to do it. You know the law, the one nobody's allowed to talk about. The one that says no one can speak of what happened the night the nine-tailed fox attacked the village? Mizuki, stop. Irika struggled to rise, blood dripping from his lips. That's forbidden. The fourth Hokage didn't kill the nine-tails that night, Mizuki continued, ignoring him entirely, savoring every word like poison honey. He couldn't. Nobody can kill a tailed beast. All he could do was seal it away, inside a newborn baby. Inside you, Naruto. You've been carrying that monster inside your gut this entire time. That's why everyone in this village hates you. That's why you'll never be anything but the fox's prison. The clearing went dead silent except for the wind moving through the trees and the ragged sound of Irika's breathing. Naruto stood frozen, the scroll forgotten in his hands, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. The stares he'd endured his entire life. The whispers that cut off the moment he entered a room. The parents who pulled their children away from him on the street. Every unexplained cruelty of his childhood suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity, and for one terrible moment, it looked like something inside him had simply shattered. That's not. He stammered. It's true, Mizuki said, almost gently now, twirling the giant shuriken on one finger like a toy. And now that you know, there's really no reason for you to keep living, is there? Nobody will miss the fox's cage. He hurled the shuriken. Have you ever had a moment where time seemed to just stop? Where every instinct in your body screamed at you to move, but your legs simply wouldn't listen? That's exactly the moment Irika found himself in, watching that massive shuriken spin end over end toward the boy he'd spent years quietly rooting for, the boy nobody else in the village had ever bothered to actually see. Irika didn't think. He simply moved, throwing himself bodily in front of Naruto for the second time that night, the blade catching him hard enough to send him crashing into the dirt, blood spattering across the grass. Sensei! Naruto's voice cracked, some deep animal part of him breaking through the shock. He dropped to his knees beside Irika, hands hovering uselessly over the wound, not knowing what to do, only knowing he couldn't lose the one person who'd ever treated him like he mattered. Why? Naruto's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you protect me? Everyone hates me. I'm a monster, just like he said. You're not a monster, Irika managed through gritted teeth, blood staining his teeth as he forced a weak, exhausted smile. You're Naruto Uzumaki. You've always just been Naruto. That's all you've ever been to me. Above them, Mizuki laughed, already forming hand seals for a second attack. Touching. Truly. But it changes nothing. Now get out of my way, Irika, so I can finish what should have been done 12 years ago. And that's when something inside Naruto broke, not in the way Mizuki intended, but in an entirely different, far more dangerous way. If you've stuck with us this far, you already know this channel doesn't do ordinary what-if stories. And this is the part where everything gets turned on its head. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time, because you are not ready for what happens next. Naruto rose slowly to his feet, standing between Mizuki and Irika's fallen body, fists clenched so hard his knuckles had gone white. Something was different in the air around him, a pressure, subtle at first, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The torchlight flickered. The grass beneath his sandals seemed to ripple, ever so slightly, as if something enormous were stirring just beneath the surface of the earth. Get out of the way, brat, Mizuki sneered, raising a kunai. Or I'll cut you down right here. No, Naruto said, and his voice had changed, quieter, but somehow carrying more weight than all his usual shouting combined. I'm not letting you touch him again. Mizuki lunged. What happened next would be talked about, quietly, cautiously, and eventually not so quietly at all, for years to come within certain circles of the village. Because as Mizuki's kunai closed the distance, the earth beneath Naruto's feet simply answered him. Thick roots tore up from the soil in an instant, twisting and coiling with impossible speed, wrapping around Mizuki's legs and yanking him off balance mid-strike. He crashed to the ground with a strangled cry of shock, and before he could even process what had happened, more roots followed, thin, woody tendrils climbing up his limbs, pinning his arms to his sides, then his torso, then finally circling his throat with just enough pressure to still him completely without crushing the life from him. Naruto stood in the center of the clearing, arms still raised from where he'd thrown them out on instinct, staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. Around him, where moments before there had only been grass and packed dirt, a small grove of pale, gnarled roots and slender young saplings had erupted from the earth, some of them already unfurling tiny green leaves in the torchlight, as though months of growth had been compressed into the space of a single heartbeat. What? Mizuki's voice was a strangled whisper, his eyes bulging with something far beyond simple fear. That's not possible. That jutsu died with him. That's the first Hokage's power. Naruto had no idea what Mizuki meant. He didn't know the name Hashirama Senju. He didn't know that what had just erupted from the ground around him was a technique so rare, so precious, that the entire Second Shinobi World War had been shaped by armies desperate to steal even a fragment of it. All he knew was that his hands were shaking. His knees felt like they might give out any second, and somehow, impossibly, Mizuki was pinned to the ground by living wood that had answered a plea Naruto hadn't even known how to voice. Behind him, Iruka lifted his head weakly from the dirt, staring at the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. Naruto, he breathed. What did you just do? I don't know, Naruto admitted, voice trembling, adrenaline finally giving way to sheer bewilderment. I don't know, sensei. I didn't want him to hurt you anymore. The roots holding Mizuki creaked and tightened another fraction, and the man let out a whimper of genuine terror, all his earlier bravado gone completely. Get it off me! Get this thing off me! But Naruto barely heard him. He was staring at his own palms, turning them over slowly in the flickering torchlight, watching faint traces of chakra still curling off his fingertips like green-tinted smoke. Whatever this was, it had come from somewhere deep inside him, someplace he hadn't even known existed until the exact moment he needed it most. It was at that precise moment that a third figure stepped into the clearing, and every single person present felt the temperature of the night air seem to drop. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage of Konoha, moved through the tree line with a speed that belied his age, robes billowing, expression carved from stone. He'd felt the disturbance the moment it happened. Every experienced shinobi in a certain radius had, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him upon arrival. A living wall of roots and saplings, grown in mere seconds, holding a traitorous academy instructor pinned to the earth. A wounded Chunin bleeding into the grass. And in the center of it all, a 12-year-old orphan staring at his own hands like he just discovered he was someone else entirely. Hiruzen's pipe nearly slipped from his fingers. He had lived through the era of the first Hokage. He had trained under the very man whose legend this power belonged to. He had spent decades believing, hoping, in some quiet corner of his heart he rarely let himself examine, that such a gift might one day resurface in the village his old friend and rival had founded together. He simply never, in his wildest imagination, expected to find it here. Not now. Not in him. Hokage-sama. Iruka struggled to sit up, wincing against his injuries. Mizuki, he attacked me, he tried to steal the forbidden scroll, he told Naruto about the... Hiruzen raised a single hand, and Iruka fell silent immediately, understanding without needing to be told that whatever else needed discussing would not be discussed here, in the open, where any set of ears might be listening. I am aware of what Mizuki attempted, Hiruzen said, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who has personally lived through more crises than most villages see in a century. 2A and BU dropped from the treetops without a sound, moving immediately to secure the trapped, whimpering Mizuki, prying loose the wooden restraints with careful, wary hands, as though half expecting them to lash out. Only once Mizuki had been bound in proper restraints and hauled away, cursing and pleading in equal measure, did Hiruzen finally turn his full attention to the boy still standing in the center of that impossible grove. Naruto flinched under the weight of that gaze, immediately assuming the worst. Old man, I didn't mean to do anything wrong, I just wanted to protect Iruka-sensei. I didn't even know I could. Naruto. Hiruzen's voice was gentle, gentler than Naruto had ever heard it, cutting through his rising panic like a hand settling on a spooked animal. You are not in trouble. Naruto blinked. I'm not? You saved your teacher's life tonight, Hiruzen said, crouching down slowly to bring himself eye level with the boy, the way he might have decades ago with a much younger student of his own. And you did something else tonight as well. Something I need you to keep quiet, for now, not because it's shameful, but because it's precious. And precious things need protecting before the whole world learns they exist. He reached out and rested a weathered hand against the nearest sapling, feeling the faint hum of chakra still lingering within its wood grain, and something in his old, tired eyes glimmered with an emotion that looked almost like disbelief chased by wonder. Do you know whose technique this resembles, Naruto? Naruto shook his head slowly. Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, watching the torchlight flicker across dozens of small green leaves that shouldn't have existed an hour ago, thinking of an old friend long dead. A rivalry turned into a village, a legacy he had assumed was buried forever in the earth alongside its creator. We'll talk more soon, he finally said. Tonight you rest. Tonight you did something extraordinary, whether you understand it yet or not. He straightened, robes settling around him, and cast one final glance across the small grove of impossible, newborn trees glowing faintly silver in the moonlight, a sight Konoha had not seen in this exact form for longer than most of its shinobi had been alive. Iruka, Hiruzen said quietly, without turning around, take him home safely. And Naruto. Naruto looked up. Tell no one what happened here tonight. Not yet. There are people in this village who would see what you can do, and want to use it for reasons that have nothing to do with what's best for you. With that, the third Hokage turned and walked back into the darkness of the trees, already turning over in his mind the shape of decisions that would need to be made, training regimens quietly restructured, team placements reconsidered, secrets carefully guarded from eyes both inside and outside the village walls. Behind him, Naruto stood in the center of a small forest that had not existed an hour earlier, staring down at his own hands in the moonlight, utterly unaware that he had just taken the very first step toward becoming something Konoha had not seen in generations. Something the last person to wield had once been called the strongest shinobi the world had ever known. The Hokage's office smelled faintly of old parchment, and the lingering smoke of a pipe that had gone cold hours ago, untouched on the corner of the desk. Hiruzen Sarutobi had not slept. He sat behind that same desk he'd occupied for decades, a sprawl of old documents spread out before him, village registries, chakra signature archives, and one very particular scroll he hadn't looked at in over a decade, its edges yellowed and brittle with age. He'd sent for it the moment he returned from the forest the night before, rousing a sleepy records clerk from his bed with an urgency that had left the poor man too startled to ask questions. Now, in the pale gray light of early morning, Hiruzen unrolled it across his desk with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. Chakra signature analysis. Senju Hashirama. The records were old, recorded decades ago by the very same analysis division that still, in theory, existed within the village, though its methods had grown far more refined since these notes were first inked. Beside the archived signature, Hiruzen laid a second scroll, a fresh sample, taken discreetly from the soil of last night's clearing before the grove of impossible saplings could be disturbed by curious eyes. He didn't need the technical charts and diagrams to know what he was looking at. He'd fought alongside Hashirama Senju. He'd trained under the man's own philosophy of the will of fire before that phrase had even been coined into village doctrine. He knew that chakra signature the way you know the sound of your own mother's voice, not through analysis, but through memory carved so deep it needed no proof. But knowing something in his gut, and being able to act on it responsibly were two very different things. So he compared the charts anyway, methodically, the way any good shinobi leader should, cross-referencing wavelength patterns and density readings until the conclusion sitting in his chest for the past 12 hours had nowhere left to hide. The match wasn't approximate. It wasn't a vague resonance he could explain away as coincidence. It was near identical. Hiruzen set down his pen and sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his office as though it might offer him some kind of answer. Somewhere in this village, a 12-year-old orphan boy, a boy everyone had written off as hopeless, as a nuisance, as a burden the village merely tolerated, was carrying inside him not only the most dangerous tailed beast ever sealed by human hands, but also a dormant echo of the single most legendary shinobi ability in the village's entire history. Hashirama, he murmured to the empty room, an old, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite everything. You stubborn, unpredictable old friend. Even in death, you find ways to surprise me. By mid-morning, Hiruzen had summoned exactly 3 people to a private meeting room deep within the Hokage Tower, a room reserved for discussions the walls themselves were not meant to repeat. Iruka arrived first, moving stiffly, a fresh set of bandages wrapped tightly across his back and shoulder beneath his uniform. He'd refused the hospital's insistence that he stay overnight, citing duty, though everyone in the room understood the real reason was that he wanted to be present for whatever conversation was about to happen concerning his student. Next came a senior member of the village's torture and interrogation division, a stern-faced woman named Ibiki's superior, someone Hiruzen trusted with information that could never, under any circumstance, leave this room. She'd spent the early hours of the morning extracting a full confession from Mizuki, and the report she now handed across the table only confirmed what Hiruzen had already suspected. He's been feeding information to Orochimaru's network for over a year, she said flatly, sliding a folder across the table. Financial motives, mostly, along with some lingering resentment over never being promoted past Chunin. The scroll theft was his own idea. But Hokage-sama, there's something else you'll want to hear directly. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. He mentioned the wood technique unprompted, several times, during questioning. Kept muttering about it even when we weren't asking. He seems fixated. Almost as frightened of it as he is of us. Hiruzen exhaled slowly through his nose, tapping one finger against the folder without opening it. Make sure that detail stays contained to this room. Officially, Mizuki attempted to steal a forbidden scroll for personal gain and assaulted a fellow shinobi in the process. Nothing more goes into any report that could be read by unauthorized eyes. Understood. She hesitated. Hokage-sama, if I may ask, what exactly did happen out there? Hiruzen glanced at Iruka, who gave the smallest of nods, silent permission to include him in whatever was about to be said. The interrogation officer had already proven her discretion. There was little point hiding the truth from someone who'd already heard Mizuki babbling about it half-conscious. What happened, Hiruzen said carefully, is something I need every person in this room to treat with the same weight you'd give an S-rank village secret. Because that is precisely what it now is. He spread his hands across the desk, palms down, an old habit from decades of delivering difficult news. Naruto Uzumaki displayed an ability last night matching, almost precisely, the chakra signature of Hashirama Senju's wood-release technique. The room went very still. That's... The interrogation officer started, then stopped herself, clearly searching for words that wouldn't sound absurd out loud. Hokage-sama, that bloodline died with him. There's no recorded case of it resurfacing in any Senju descendant in over 60 years, let alone in someone with no known Senju lineage at all. I'm aware, Hiruzen said grimly. Which is precisely why I need this handled with extreme care. Whatever the source of this ability, inherited, spontaneous, connected to something else entirely we don't yet understand, the moment certain people in this village learn of it, they will not see a child. They will see a weapon. Or a specimen. Or a political opportunity. Iruka's jaw tightened. Everyone in the room understood, without needing it spelled out further, exactly which certain people the Hokage was referring to. If you've been following this channel for a while, you already know the name that's about to come up. And if you're new, buckle in, because Konoha's shadow politics are every bit as dangerous as anything Naruto will face on the battlefield. The council chamber that afternoon held its usual assembly of clan heads and senior advisors, the lone murmur of routine village business drifting through the air, trade agreements, mission allocations, the usual bureaucratic hum that kept Konoha running day to day. Hiruzen sat through most of it with the practiced patience of a man who had chaired 10,000 meetings just like it, offering nothing beyond his usual measured input. It was only afterward, once the General Assembly had cleared out, that the real conversation began, a smaller, quieter gathering consisting of Hiruzen and his 2 oldest advisors, Hamura and Koharu, along with one uninvited figure who had, as always, found a way to make himself present anyway. Danzo Shimura stood near the back of the room, leaning lightly on his cane, his single visible eye tracking Hiruzen's every movement with the patient, unreadable focus of a hawk watching a field mouse. I heard, Danzo said without preamble, once the door had closed, that there was an incident last night involving the Uzumaki boy and the Forbidden Scroll. There was an attempted theft, orchestrated by a traitorous academy instructor, Hiruzen replied evenly. It has been dealt with. And the boy? Uninjured. He assisted in subduing the traitor before my ANBU arrived. Danzo's eye narrowed a fraction, the barest crack in his otherwise stone-carved expression. Assisted how? Hiruzen had anticipated this question long before he'd walked into the room, and his answer came smooth and unhesitating. Through sheer stubbornness and a well-placed clone technique, from what I understand. The boy has always had unusually large chakra reserves. Surely that isn't news to anyone in this room. It was, technically, not a lie. Merely an incomplete truth, carefully polished into something that would satisfy without inviting further scrutiny. Hamura and Koharu exchanged a brief glance but said nothing further, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Danzo, however, lingered a moment longer, his gaze cutting sideways toward Hiruzen with the particular intensity of a man who had built an entire secret organization on the principle of never quite believing anything at face value. Large reserves alone don't explain restraining an armed chunin, Danzo said slowly. Desperation does wonders for improvisation, Hiruzen replied, meeting that single eye without flinching. I trust you didn't come here merely to discuss an academy scuffle, Danzo. Was there something else? A beat passed. Then another. Finally, Danzo inclined his head slightly, apparently deciding, for now, not to press further. Merely due diligence, he said. The boy carries a significant burden for this village. It would be irresponsible not to monitor his development closely. He is monitored, Hiruzen said, an edge of finality creeping into his tone that even Danzo knew better than to push against directly. By me. Danzo's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Of course, Hokage-sama. He left without further comment, cane tapping softly against the floor with each measured step, and it wasn't until the door had fully closed behind him that Hiruzen allowed himself to exhale the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He suspects something, Koharu said quietly. He suspects everything, always, Hiruzen replied, rubbing at his temples with weary fingers. The question is whether suspicion alone is enough to make him act. We need to move carefully from here. Very carefully. That evening, Hiruzen found himself walking a familiar path through the village, one he hadn't taken with any real purpose in years, toward the quiet, unassuming memorial stone dedicated to the founders of Konoha. Unlike the grand monument carved into the cliffside overlooking the village, this smaller stone sat tucked within a peaceful garden near the Hokage residence, a place few villagers ever thought to visit, its inscriptions worn soft by decades of rain and wind. He knelt slowly before it, joints protesting the movement, and rested one weathered hand against the cool stone bearing Hashirama Senju's name. You always did have a habit of leaving me with impossible problems, Hiruzen murmured, a faint, rueful smile ghosting across his face. Even now. Even like this. He thought back to the early days of the village, to a young Hashirama standing atop this very hill with Madara Uchiha at his side, both of them still believing, however briefly, that the impossible dream of lasting peace between rival clans might actually be achievable. He thought of Hashirama's endless, boundless optimism, his stubborn insistence that people could change, that even the most broken circumstances could grow into something beautiful given enough patience and enough care. A tree grows strongest, Hashirama used to say, back when Hiruzen was young enough to still be learning at his feet, not despite the storms it weathers, but because of them. Hiruzen glanced upward at the darkening sky, thinking of a small, forgotten orphan boy standing in the center of an impossible grove of saplings, utterly unaware of the legacy suddenly stirring awake inside him. If you're watching from wherever you've ended up, old friend, he said softly, I hope you'll forgive me for what I'm about to do next, because I intend to give that boy every chance to grow into whatever you clearly still believe he can become. Even if it means bending a few rules along the way. If you're enjoying how this story is building, now's a perfect time to smash that like button, because next, we're diving into exactly how far Hiruzen is willing to bend those rules. And trust me, it's further than you'd expect from a man who's spent his whole life following them. The following morning, Hiruzen sat alone in his office once more, this time with a very different set of documents spread across his desk. The finalized team placement rosters for this year's graduating class, due to be announced publicly within the next 2 days. Officially, team assignments were determined through a careful balance of skill complementarity, personality compatibility, and Jonin instructor availability, a process that, in an ordinary year, Hiruzen reviewed only briefly before signing off on whatever the academy staff had already worked out amongst themselves. This was not an ordinary year. He studied the proposed rosters with far more scrutiny than usual, running through the possibilities in his mind like a shogi player mapping out a dozen moves in advance. Naruto's raw chakra reserves and this newly discovered ability demanded an instructor with both the tactical sharpness to recognize what he was working with and the discretion to keep it contained. It also demanded teammates whose own skill sets wouldn't be overshadowed or destabilized by whatever Naruto was about to become. His finger traced down the list of available Jonin instructors until it stopped on a familiar name, Kakashi Hatake. Kakashi was young for the responsibility of leading a genin team, but he was also, without question, one of the sharpest tactical minds currently active within the village, someone capable of recognizing an anomaly and adapting his teaching methods accordingly, rather than forcing a square peg into a round hole out of rigid adherence to standard academy curriculum. More importantly, Kakashi had the security clearance and personal discipline necessary to keep a secret buried exactly as deep as it needed to stay. Hiruzen made a small notation beside Kakashi's name, then turned his attention to the proposed team rosters themselves. The academy staff's original suggestion had paired Naruto with 2 other underperforming students, a grouping meant simply to balance out the stronger teams elsewhere in the class. Hiruzen crossed it out and began rewriting. Sasuke Uchiha, the top-ranked student in the entire graduating class, and not incidentally, a boy whose own bloodline made him uniquely capable of recognizing and respecting the gravity of hidden power without panicking at the sight of it. Sakura Haruno, sharp-minded, quick to adapt, someone whose growing skill in chakra control theory might, with the right encouragement, eventually prove useful in helping Naruto understand the mechanics of what he could do rather than simply reacting to it on instinct. Team 7. Hiruzen sat back, studying the reformed roster with a slow, considering nod. It wasn't a perfect solution. Sasuke's simmering rivalry with anyone perceived as competition was a variable he'd need to monitor carefully, and Sakura's early infatuation with Sasuke rather than genuine investment in her own growth was a concern for an entirely different conversation. But of every possible configuration available to him, this one gave Naruto the best combination of watchful instructor oversight and teammates unlikely to either exploit or unravel under the weight of his secret. He finalized the roster, sealed it, and sent it down to the Academy Administration Office before he could second-guess himself any further. Naruto, for his part, spent those same 2 days in a state of restless, uncharacteristic quiet. He hadn't told anyone what happened in that clearing, not because Hiruzen had ordered him to keep silent, though he had, but because Naruto genuinely didn't know how to put it into words even if he'd wanted to. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, roots tearing up through solid earth, saplings unfurling impossible leaves in the space of a single breath, all of it pouring out of him like something that had been waiting his entire life for permission to exist. And beneath all of that, quieter but far heavier, sat the other truth Mizuki had thrown at him like a weapon, the truth about the 9-tailed fox sealed somewhere deep inside his own body. He sat on the edge of his small apartment bed that second night, staring down at his own stomach as though he might actually be able to see through skin and muscle to whatever lay coiled beneath. A monster. That's what Mizuki had called it. That's what half the village, apparently, had always secretly believed about him, even if no one had ever explained why. But if I'm really a monster, Naruto thought, turning his hands over slowly in the dim lamplight, remembering the sensation of chakra pouring out of his palms in that clearing, then why did something inside me choose to protect Iruka-sensei instead of hurting him? It was a question with no easy answer, and Naruto, for possibly the first time in his short, chaotic life, found himself sitting with genuine uncertainty rather than immediately papering over it with bravado and forced grins. Something had changed inside him 2 nights ago, and he didn't yet have the emotional vocabulary to process exactly what that meant for who he was, or who he might become. A knock at his door startled him out of his thoughts. "Naruto? It's me." He opened the door to find Irika standing there, still moving with careful stiffness from his healing wound, holding 2 steaming cups of tea and a small paper bag that smelled unmistakably of freshly cooked ramen. "Sensei?" Naruto blinked in surprise. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be resting?" "Probably," Irika admitted with a tired but genuine smile, stepping inside without waiting for a formal invitation. "But I figured you could probably use some company tonight. And some food that isn't instant." They sat together at Naruto's small, cluttered kitchen table, and for a long while neither of them said much of anything, simply eating in a silence that felt, for once, comfortable rather than empty. "Sensei," Naruto finally said, staring down into his cup of tea, "am I a bad person? Because of what's inside me?" Irika set down his chopsticks carefully, giving the question the weight it deserved rather than brushing it aside with easy reassurance. "Naruto, look at me," he said quietly. Naruto lifted his eyes reluctantly. "What's sealed inside you is not who you are. It never has been, and it never will be. You are the boy who pulled every prank in this village just to get people to look at him, even when it meant getting yelled at instead of smiled at. You're the boy who spent hours in the forest last night training himself half to exhaustion, not for revenge or power, but because he wanted to prove he could pass an exam honestly. And 2 nights ago, you're the boy who protected me without a second's hesitation, even when you had absolutely no idea what was happening to your own body in that moment." He reached across the table and rested a firm hand on Naruto's shoulder. "None of that sounds like a monster to me. It sounds exactly like someone worth believing in." For a moment, Naruto's carefully maintained composure cracked, something suspiciously bright welling up in his eyes before he scrubbed it away with the back of his sleeve, forcing an embarrassed laugh. "Man, don't get all sappy on me, Sensei," he mumbled, though the words came out thick. Irika just smiled and let it go, understanding better than most exactly how much that small moment of reassurance had mattered. "There's something else," Irika said after a moment, deciding this was as good a time as any to address it. "Team placements are being finalized. I don't know all the details yet, but Hokage-sama personally reviewed the rosters this year. I have a feeling wherever you end up, it isn't going to be an accident." Naruto perked up slightly at that. "You think the old man's looking out for me?" "I think," Irika said carefully, "that Hokage-sama sees something in you worth protecting carefully. Whatever that something turns out to mean for your future, I have no doubt he's already thinking several steps ahead on your behalf." 2 days later, the academy classroom buzzed with the particular electric anticipation that comes with finally learning your genin team assignment, the culmination of years of training about to crystallize into the specific people you'd be working alongside, possibly for years to come. Irika stood at the front of the room, reading down the finalized list with the careful, measured cadence of someone who had delivered this exact announcement dozens of times before, though today there was a subtle undercurrent of something else in his voice that only Naruto, watching closely, seemed to notice. "Team 7, Irika announced. Naruto Uzumaki." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the classroom, several students already exchanging knowing, faintly pitying looks, clearly assuming whatever team Naruto ended up on was destined to be the weak link of the graduating class. "Sakura Haruno." Sakura's face lit with visible hope before Irika even finished the sentence, practically bouncing in her seat. "And Sasuke Uchiha." The room went absolutely still for half a second before erupting, Sakura's hopeful expression exploding into pure, unrestrained joy, several other girls in the class groaning in open jealousy, and Naruto himself sitting frozen in stunned disbelief, staring across the room at Sasuke, who merely offered the barest, unimpressed glance in return before looking away entirely. "Me? On a team with Sasuke?" Naruto thought, equal parts thrilled and deeply confused. "There's no way that's a coincidence. Your Jonin instructor," Irika continued, "will be Kakashi Hatake." Naruto didn't recognize the name, but the way several of the older students in the room exchanged surprised, respectful whispers told him it clearly meant something significant to those who understood Konoha's shinobi ranks better than he currently did. Across the room, seated near the back where he'd been quietly observing the entire announcement, Hiruzen Sarutobi allowed himself the faintest, satisfied exhale. watching the pieces of his careful arrangement finally click into place exactly as he'd planned. One step at a time, Naruto, he thought, rising quietly and slipping out a side door before the celebrating students even noticed his presence. Grow into whatever you're meant to become. I'll do everything within my power to make sure the wrong people don't get there first. That night, alone once more in his office, Hiruzen unrolled a fresh, blank scroll and began drafting a private training curriculum, one that would exist in no official academy record, one that only a small handful of trusted individuals would ever know about. Chakra Nature Affinity Theory. Historical records on would release mechanics, however fragmentary they might be. Careful notes on how to introduce such training gradually, without overwhelming a boy who, as far as anyone could tell, had absolutely no prior conceptual framework for what he was even attempting to control. He paused partway through, setting down his brush, and allowed himself one final thought before turning in for the night. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of Konoha's political underbelly, a man with a bandaged eye was almost certainly already turning over questions he hadn't been fully satisfied with today. And somewhere further beyond the village walls entirely, a rogue Sannin who had once been counted among Konoha's most brilliant minds had, according to a captured trader's frightened confession, taken a very particular interest in a technique everyone believed had died out generations ago. The secret was safe for now. But secrets in this world, Hiruzen knew all too well from decades of hard experience, had a way of finding cracks to slip through no matter how carefully you tried to seal them. The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the rooftops of Konoha when Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke arrived at their designated meeting spot, a quiet training ground tucked behind the academy, chosen specifically, though none of the genin knew it, for its relative privacy. "He's late," Sakura muttered, arms crossed, glancing at the empty clearing for what had to be the 10th time in 15 minutes. "Course he is," Naruto grumbled, flopping down onto the grass with theatrical exasperation, though internally his mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened over the past few days. He hadn't told Sakura or Sasuke anything about the clearing, about Mizuki, about the strange, impossible thing that had torn up out of the earth at his command. Hiruzen's warning echoed in the back of his mind every time the words threatened to spill out of him. "Tell no one." "Not yet." Sasuke leaned silently against a nearby tree, arms folded, dark eyes occasionally flicking toward Naruto with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Something about the dobe seemed different lately, quieter in a way that didn't quite fit the loudmouth reputation that preceded him. Sasuke couldn't quite place what had changed. He simply filed the observation away, the way he filed away most things, for later consideration. 3 hours later than the agreed time, a puff of smoke announced the arrival of a tall, silver-haired jonin with a mask covering the lower half of his face and a forehead protector tilted at an angle that covered one eye entirely. "Yo," Kakashi Hatake said, raising a lazy hand in greeting, entirely unbothered by Sakura's immediate, "Furious you're late. A black cat crossed my path, so I had to take the long way around," Kakashi said mildly, an obvious lie so thin it barely qualified as an excuse at all. "Anyway, let's get straight into introductions. Names, likes, dislikes, dreams for the future, that sort of thing." Sakura went first, her introduction largely consisting of a list of things she liked, with frequent, unsubtle glances toward Sasuke, and a giggling refusal to state any dislikes at all. Sasuke followed with a clipped, joyless recitation about not having many things he liked, plenty of things he didn't, and an ambition that sounded less like a dream and more like an oath sworn through gritted teeth. Something about restoring his clan and eliminating a certain someone. Then it was Naruto's turn. "Name's Naruto Uzumaki," he said, grinning wide in his usual boisterous manner. "I like ramen, especially at Ichiraku's. I dislike the 3 minutes you have to wait for the water to boil before you can eat it. And my dream is to become Hokage, so strong that everyone in this whole village has to look up to me and admit I'm not just some." He caught himself before the words dead last could slip out, some old habit of self-deprecation rising automatically before he swallowed it back down. "Some nobody," he finished instead, a little quieter than he'd started. Kakashi's visible eye lingered on him for just a fraction longer than the others, an unreadable flicker crossing behind that single dark iris. He'd read Naruto's file the night before. He'd also received a private, sealed briefing directly from Hiruzen himself, one that had left even a man as unflappable as Kakashi genuinely stunned into silence for several long seconds. "All right," Kakashi said, clapping his hands together lightly. "Tomorrow, meet back here at 5 in the morning for your real genin test. Oh, and don't eat breakfast, or you'll throw up." He vanished in a puff of smoke before anyone could ask the obvious follow-up questions, leaving 3 confused genin standing in the clearing wondering exactly what they just signed up for. You already know how this part of the story usually goes, if you've watched enough of these tales unfold: the bell test, the lesson about teamwork, the whole ordeal designed to teach a bunch of overconfident kids that shinobi don't succeed by acting alone. And sure enough, the next morning played out largely the same way it always does. 2 bells, 3 genin, an impossible task engineered to force cooperation rather than individual glory. But there was one small, telling difference buried within that familiar structure, one that Kakashi noticed immediately and filed away with the same careful discretion he brought to every S-rank secret he'd ever guarded. When Naruto lunged directly at Kakashi early in the test, brimming with his usual reckless overconfidence, Kakashi effortlessly caught his wrist and hauled him off the ground with contemptuous ease, the same way he'd handled a dozen overeager genin before him. Except this time, as Naruto's feet dangled helplessly above the forest floor, the ground beneath them trembled, just slightly, just for a heartbeat, and a faint spray of loose soil kicked up around Kakashi's sandals as though something beneath the surface had briefly, instinctively responded to Naruto's distress. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed slightly. He released Naruto, letting him drop, and said nothing about it in the moment, though the observation settled itself firmly into the back of his mind for later analysis. By the end of the exercise, after Sakura's fear-driven paralysis, Sasuke's grudging realization that raw talent alone wasn't enough, and Naruto's uncharacteristic decision to share his lunch with the supposedly starving Sasuke and Sakura despite Kakashi's explicit threat of punishment, Kakashi called the whole thing off with an air of grudging approval. "You pass," he said simply, and when Sakura asked why, given that none of them had actually managed to secure a single bell, Kakashi offered them a rare piece of genuine wisdom about the nature of teamwork over individual glory that seemed to land, at least partially, even on Sasuke's typically closed-off expression. But that evening, once his new genin had scattered back to their homes, Kakashi found himself walking not toward his own apartment, but toward the Hokage Tower, a single question weighing heavily on his mind. "You felt it too, then?" Hiruzen said without looking up from the paperwork scattered across his desk, the moment Kakashi entered his office. "The ground moved when I grabbed him," Kakashi confirmed, closing the door behind him with quiet deliberateness. "Just slightly. Like something reacted to the physical contact. Hokage-sama, your briefing mentioned would release, but I confess I assumed that was closer to a singular, dramatic event brought on by extreme circumstances rather than something that might resurface during an ordinary training exercise." Hiruzen finally looked up, setting down his brush with a tired but thoughtful expression. "So did I, if I'm being honest. Which tells us something important, Kakashi. Whatever this ability truly is, it isn't merely a one-time reaction to extreme stress. It may be tied more closely to his emotional state and instinctive responses than we initially assumed. That makes it both more promising and considerably more dangerous to manage carelessly." Kakashi settled into the chair across from the desk, arms crossed, turning the implications over in his mind with the same careful precision he'd bring to analyzing an enemy's fighting style. "You want me to start testing his chakra nature directly," he said. "It wasn't really a question. I want you to do it carefully, and privately," Hiruzen replied. "No official academy paperwork. No mention to his teammates of what you find. If my suspicions are correct, we're looking at a dual affinity, earth and water in combination, the precise foundation required for would-release manifestation. I'd like that confirmed properly, through legitimate testing, rather than relying solely on second-hand observation of an unconscious reaction." Kakashi nodded slowly. "And once it's confirmed?" Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, gazing out the window at the village spread below, lights beginning to flicker on across rooftops as evening settled in. "Then we begin teaching him properly," he said finally. "Not as an experiment. Not as a weapon to be sharpened for the village's future convenience. As a student who deserves every opportunity to understand and master what's growing inside him, on his own terms, at his own pace. If you've ever taken one of those standard chakra affinity tests yourself, or at least seen them depicted plenty of times in stories like this, you already know how it typically works. A small square of specially treated paper, thin as a leaf, reacts differently depending on which of the 5 elemental chakra natures a person's chakra resonates with most strongly. It crumples for earth. It splits for wind. It dampens for water. It burns for fire. It creases for lightning. Most shinobi discover a single dominant affinity this way, sometimes 2 if they're unusually versatile. It is exceptionally rare enough to be the stuff of legend, for someone to display a strong dual affinity capable of combining into an entirely new elemental nature altogether. Kakashi called Naruto aside privately 2 days later, waiting until Sakura and Sasuke had left for the day following a routine team training exercise, ostensibly to discuss some additional individual coaching that Naruto, in typical fashion, assumed was some kind of punishment for his earlier antics. "Am I in trouble?" Naruto asked immediately, arms already crossed defensively. "No," Kakashi said, an amused crinkle forming at the corner of his visible eye. "Quite the opposite, actually. Hold this." He produced a small square of chakra paper and handed it over. "Focus your chakra into it, same way you would for any basic technique." Naruto shrugged, clearly expecting nothing particularly interesting to happen, and channeled a small trickle of chakra into the paper the way he'd been taught back in academy theory classes. The paper did something none of Naruto's classmates' papers had ever done during their own testing. One half crumbled instantly into fine dust, the telltale sign of a strong earth affinity. But the remaining half didn't stay dry and intact the way a purely earth-dominant reaction would suggest. Instead, it darkened and dampened visibly, moisture beading across its surface as though it had been dipped directly into water. Kakashi stared down at the split, dual-reacting paper for a long, silent moment. Naruto said, glancing between the ruined paper and Kakashi's uncharacteristically still expression. "Is that bad? Did I break it?" "No," Kakashi said slowly, a note of genuine wonder creeping into his usually lazy, unbothered tone. "No, Naruto, you didn't break anything. You just displayed something exceptionally rare, a confirmed dual affinity, earth and water, in near-perfect balance. Is that good?" Naruto asked hesitantly, clearly unsure whether to be proud or worried. Kakashi considered his next words carefully, mindful of Hiruzen's instructions to introduce this information gradually rather than all at once. "It's more than good. It means your chakra has the theoretical foundation to eventually combine those 2 elements into something far rarer, a third, composite nature most shinobi never even get the chance to attempt." Naruto's eyes went wide. "Wait, seriously? What is it? Can I learn it right now? Can you teach me?" "Slow down," Kakashi said, holding up a hand, though there was genuine warmth beneath his usual dry humor. "It's not something you rush into overnight. But yes, there's someone far better suited than me to begin guiding you through this. Someone who's been waiting rather patiently, I imagine, for the right moment to start." That evening, for the first time since the incident in the clearing, Hiruzen called Naruto into his office, not the public, formal Hokage's office where villagers submitted requests and jonin delivered mission reports, but the smaller, private study attached to his personal quarters, a space reserved for conversations that needed complete confidentiality. Naruto shuffled in nervously, still uncertain whether any of this counted as trouble despite Kakashi's reassurances. Hiruzen gestured for him to sit, setting aside his pipe and folding his hands atop the desk with the deliberate calm of a man about to share something significant. "Naruto," he began, "do you remember what you asked me, in that clearing a few nights ago? Whether I knew whose technique yours resembled?" Naruto nodded slowly. "I want to tell you the answer now. But first, I need you to understand something important. What I'm about to share with you is one of this village's most closely guarded truths. Not because it's dangerous in the way the Nine-Tails seal is dangerous, but because of how deeply it could reshape how certain people in this village view you, for better or for worse." Naruto sat up a little straighter, some instinct telling him this was a moment worth paying full attention to. "Okay. I'm listening." Hiruzen rose slowly from his desk and crossed the room to a small shelf, retrieving an old, framed photograph that had clearly seen decades of careful handling. He set it down in front of Naruto, a faded image of 2 young men standing side by side atop a familiar-looking hill, one with wild dark hair and an easy, confident smile, the other sharper-eyed and more reserved. This man, Hiruzen said, tapping the smiling figure gently, was named Hashirama Senju. He founded this village, alongside his closest friend and greatest rival. He was, without exaggeration, the single strongest and most naturally gifted shinobi this world has ever produced. Naruto stared at the photograph, something uncertain stirring in his chest. What's that got to do with me? Hashirama possessed a rare and precious ability, Hiruzen continued, settling back into his chair. An ability born from an equally rare dual chakra affinity. Earth and water combined into something entirely new. A power that allowed him to command the growth of trees and living wood itself, on a scale no one before or since has ever matched. It was said he could summon entire forests in the span of a single breath, reshape battlefields, even create constructs of astonishing complexity from nothing but raw chakra and will. Naruto's breath caught. Wait. That's what happened to me. In the clearing? That is precisely what happened to you, Hiruzen confirmed gently. Your chakra signature, and the ability it produced that night, is nearly identical to Hashirama's own. I won't pretend to fully understand why or how such a thing has resurfaced in you specifically. But Naruto, what I do know is this. You are carrying inside you an echo of one of the greatest gifts this village has ever known. For a long moment, Naruto simply sat in stunned silence, staring down at the old photograph, trying to reconcile the image of this powerful, legendary figure with the chaotic, uncontrolled surge of chakra he barely remembered from that night in the clearing. But I don't understand, he said finally, voice quieter than usual. Why me? I'm not even related to him, am I? Everyone always said I don't have a family, that nobody knows anything about my parents. I don't have a complete answer for you, Hiruzen admitted honestly, and there was something genuinely regretful in his tone as he said it. It's possible there's a distant, unknown lineage connection we simply haven't uncovered yet. It's possible this is something else entirely, some rarer phenomenon we don't yet fully understand. What I can tell you, with absolute certainty, is that this power chose to answer you in a moment of genuine need, to protect someone you cared about. That tells me far more about who you are than any bloodline chart ever could. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, turning that thought over carefully. So what happens now? He finally asked. Hiruzen allowed himself a small, warm smile. Now you train? Properly, deliberately, and, for the time being, privately. I've arranged for you to receive supplementary instruction beyond your regular team training, focused specifically on understanding and eventually mastering this ability. It will not be easy. It will demand more discipline and patience than perhaps anything you've ever attempted before. But if you're willing to commit to it fully, I believe you could, in time, become something truly extraordinary. Something bright and fierce kindled behind Naruto's eyes. The exact same stubborn determination that had carried him through years of failed exams and quiet humiliations, now finally aimed at a goal that felt, for the first time, genuinely within reach. I'm in, he said immediately, no hesitation whatsoever in his voice. Whatever it takes. I'll do it. I thought you might say that, Hiruzen said, the warmth in his expression deepening. One more thing, Naruto, before we begin. I need you to understand. This is not a secret you can share carelessly, not even with your teammates, not yet. There are people within this very village, and beyond its walls, who would see this ability and think only of how to control it, or exploit it, or take it from you entirely. Protecting this secret for now protects you. Naruto nodded seriously, the weight of that responsibility settling onto his shoulders in a way that felt, oddly, less like a burden and more like the first real trust anyone had ever placed in him. If you're excited about where this is heading, go ahead and drop a comment telling us what you think Naruto's first real technique should look like. Because training starts right now, and it does not go the way anyone expects. Training began the following week, structured carefully around Naruto's existing team schedule so as not to draw unwanted attention. 3 mornings a week, before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon, Naruto found himself slipping quietly into a secluded training ground deep within a restricted section of the Hokage's private compound, where Hiruzen himself, along with an occasional visiting specialist sworn to absolute secrecy, guided him through the fundamentals of elemental chakra manipulation. The early lessons were, frankly, exhausting in their simplicity. Long hours spent simply learning to sense and separate the two distinct chakra natures within himself, coaxing them toward a delicate, deliberate balance rather than the chaotic, instinctive surge that had erupted from him in the clearing. Hiruzen explained, with the patience of a man who had personally witnessed Hashirama's own training decades ago, that true mastery of wood release required not brute force, but harmony, a genuine internal balance between two opposing elemental forces that most shinobi never needed to reconcile within themselves at all. Chakra nature transformation, Hiruzen explained one particularly grueling morning, watching Naruto collapse backward onto the grass, drenched in sweat after his fourth consecutive failed attempt to produce even a single controlled sprout, isn't merely about brute output. Hashirama himself once told me that his ability responded most readily not when he pushed hardest, but when his intent was clearest. Try to conjure with anger, and you'll get chaos, same as what happened that night in the clearing. Try to conjure with genuine, focused purpose, and you may find the results considerably more disciplined. Naruto groaned, pushing himself back up onto his elbows. Easy for you to say. I don't even know what clear intent is supposed to feel like. Then let's find out together, Hiruzen said simply, kneeling down beside him. Close your eyes. Don't think about producing a technique at all. Think instead about the last time you felt genuinely, purely certain about protecting something important to you. Naruto closed his eyes, and almost immediately his mind returned to that clearing, not the confusion and fear of Mizuki's revelation, but the singular, overwhelming certainty he'd felt in the instant before the roots erupted from the ground. I'm not letting you touch him again. No confusion in that thought. No hesitation. Just absolute, unwavering resolve. He opened his eyes, extended one hand slowly toward the patch of bare earth in front of him, and pushed a careful trickle of chakra outward, not the desperate, uncontrolled flood from before, but something smaller, quieter, deliberately shaped by the same clear purpose he'd just remembered. A single, slender green shoot pushed up through the soil, no more than a few inches tall, trembling slightly but undeniably, entirely under his own conscious control. Naruto stared at it in stunned silence. I did it, he whispered. I actually did it on purpose this time. Hiruzen's weathered face broke into a genuine, delighted smile, the first truly unguarded expression Naruto had ever seen from the old Hokage. You did indeed. And Naruto, that right there, that small, controlled sprout, took most shinobi in history considerably longer to achieve than it just took you. Weeks passed in this manner, Naruto splitting his time between ordinary team missions with Kakashi, Sakura, and Sasuke, mundane D-rank tasks like chasing runaway cats and weeding gardens that left Naruto grumbling with familiar impatience, and his secret, grueling private sessions with Hiruzen, where progress came slowly but undeniably, sprout by sprout, root by careful root. Sasuke noticed the change first, in his usual quiet, observant way. Naruto seemed to disappear during unscheduled hours far more often than before, returning each time looking utterly exhausted but somehow, inexplicably, more grounded than his usual chaotic energy suggested he should be. Sasuke said nothing directly, though he filed the observation away carefully. The same suspicious instincts that had once made him wary of everyone around him now quietly, almost unwillingly, curious about what exactly his supposedly hopeless teammate was hiding. Sakura, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious, far too preoccupied with her own training struggles and her ongoing, largely one-sided fixation on Sasuke to notice much of anything unusual about Naruto's schedule. Kakashi noticed everything, of course, though he kept his observations strictly to himself, occasionally offering Naruto small, subtle pieces of supplementary advice about chakra control theory during team exercises, advice that, to anyone not already aware of the full picture, would have seemed like ordinary Jonin mentorship rather than carefully coordinated reinforcement of a much larger secret curriculum. One particular evening, nearly a month into this careful double life, Naruto sat exhausted on the grass of his private training ground, staring down at his own palms in the fading evening light. A modest cluster of small, healthy saplings now surrounded him in a neat, deliberate circle, nothing like the chaotic explosion of growth from that first night, but something far more meaningful in its own quiet way, proof of genuine, hard-won mastery. You've made remarkable progress, Hiruzen said, settling down onto a nearby bench with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years. Faster progress, in fact, than I initially anticipated. Still feels like I barely scratched the surface, Naruto admitted, flexing his tired fingers. Compared to what you told me Hashirama could actually do, whole forests, giant constructs, all that, this feels like nothing. Every legendary technique begins with a single sprout, Hiruzen said gently. Hashirama himself did not summon forests on his very first attempt, Naruto. Patience is not a weakness in this discipline. It is, in fact, the entire foundation upon which true mastery is built. Naruto nodded slowly, some of his usual restless impatience settling, just slightly, into something steadier and more grounded. There's something else I should mention, Hiruzen continued, a note of careful consideration entering his voice. Team 7 has been selected for its first mission beyond the village walls. A C-rank escort assignment, according to the initial request, though such classifications have, on occasion, proven considerably more complicated than they first appear. Naruto's eyes lit up immediately, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Wait, seriously? An actual mission outside the village? Indeed, Hiruzen confirmed. Kakashi will lead you, Sasuke, and Sakura on an escort assignment to Wave Country, protecting a bridge builder from what has been described as bandit interference. Something in the old Hokage's measured tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced bandit interference told the whole story, though he kept that particular suspicion carefully to himself for the moment. This will be your first true test beyond the safety of the village, Hiruzen said instead, meeting Naruto's eyes directly. Whatever challenges arise on that mission, remember what we've worked on here: control before power, purpose before instinct. Should circumstances demand it, I trust you to make the right decisions about when, and whether, to reveal what you're capable of. Naruto nodded seriously, feeling the weight of that trust settle onto his shoulders alongside a fierce, rising excitement for what lay ahead. I won't let you down, old man, he said firmly. Hiruzen smiled, the expression carrying decades of hope finally, cautiously, beginning to bear fruit. I have no doubt of that whatsoever, Naruto. The road to Wave Country stretched long and quiet, winding through forest and farmland far removed from the familiar rooftops of Konoha. Naruto walked near the front of the group, practically vibrating with excitement at his very first mission beyond the village walls, while Sakura kept a wary eye on their surprisingly grumpy client, an older man named Tazuna, who smelled faintly of dockside salt air and carried a bottle of green tea sloshing in his traveling pack, apparently for the long journey ahead. So this is a C-rank mission, huh? Naruto said, grinning as he practically skipped along the dirt road. Bandits are gonna be nothing. I could take out a whole gang by myself, believe it. Sure you could, Sasuke muttered, not even bothering to look over, though there was something slightly less dismissive in his tone than there might have been a month earlier. He'd been watching Naruto more closely lately. The way his idiot teammates seemed calmer somehow, steadier, even during the boring stretches of a long journey. Sasuke didn't understand what had changed. He simply understood that something had. It didn't take long for the mission's true nature to reveal itself. A puddle on a dry road, an obvious enough anomaly that Kakashi clocked it instantly, turned out to be concealing two Chunin-level, missing nin known as the Demon Brothers, who sprang from hiding with a chain designed to shred through their targets in a single coordinated strike. Kakashi allowed himself to be caught just long enough to confirm his suspicions about who exactly had hired these attackers, while Sasuke moved with impressive speed to pin one of the brothers against the tree, and Naruto, after a brief, humiliating moment of panic that saw him frozen at the sight of real, lethal violence for the first time, managed to help subdue the second attacker with a well-timed substitution and a solid kick that Sakura would later insist was at least 50% luck. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, Kakashi turned a level, unimpressed stare toward their client. Tazuna, he said evenly, I believe you have some explaining to do. This mission was classified as C-rank. Chunin-level missing nin hired specifically to intercept you suggests something considerably higher. Tazuna's shoulders slumped, and after a long, guilty pause, the whole truth came spilling out. Gato, the ruthless shipping magnate who had strangled Wave Country's economy into poverty and despair, terrified of the bridge Tazuna was building that would finally break his monopoly over the region's trade routes, terrified enough to hire increasingly dangerous shinobi to make sure that bridge was never finished. I'm sorry, Tazuna admitted, staring down at his own hands. I couldn't afford a higher-ranked mission. And my country, we don't have much left to offer beyond what little I had to spare. But if I don't finish this bridge, my whole village stays trapped under that man's boot forever. My grandson deserves better than that. Kakashi weighed the ethical and practical considerations for a long moment, glancing briefly at his 3 genin. Technically, the mission's parameters had been violated badly enough to justify withdrawing entirely, but something in Tezuna's desperate honesty, and something in the determined expressions already forming on his students' faces, made the decision for him. We'll continue, Kakashi said finally. But everyone needs to understand, this is no longer a simple escort job. From here forward, treat every step of this journey as a genuine A-rank threat environment. Naruto swallowed hard, but underneath the fear, something else stirred too, a fierce, stubborn resolve that felt, for the first time, backed by genuine capability rather than empty bravado. I can handle this, he told himself silently. I've got something real now. I just need to be smart about how I use it. If you've ever had someone underestimate you right before you proved them completely wrong, you already know the feeling that's about to hit an entire village of shinobi hunters. Because up next, Team 7 is about to meet Zabuza Momochi, and nothing about this fight goes the way anyone expects. The mist rolled in thick and sudden along the narrow forest road, swallowing visibility within seconds, and Kakashi's entire demeanor shifted instantly from relaxed escort duty into something far sharper and more alert. Get down! Protect Tezuna! He barked, and his 3 genin scrambled into a defensive formation around their client just as a massive figure materialized from the fog, enormous, shirtless despite the chill. A wrap blade the size of a small boat balanced casually across one broad shoulder. Well, well, the man rumbled, voice carrying an unmistakable note of amused menace. Kakashi of the Sharingan. I'd heard rumors you might be involved in this little escort job. This should be interesting. Zabuza Momochi, Kakashi said quietly, reaching up to lift his forehead protector, revealing a swirling, crimson eye that immediately sent a visible ripple of tension through the surrounding mist. The demon of the hidden mist. I suppose I should be flattered Gato thought this job required someone of your reputation. What followed was a battle unlike anything Naruto, Sasuke, or Sakura had ever witnessed, Zabuza's overwhelming killing intent alone nearly paralyzing all 3 genin where they stood, a suffocating pressure unlike anything the Academy's training exercises had ever remotely prepared them for. Kakashi matched him blow for blow, technique for technique, the Sharingan tracking and countering Zabuza's brutal silent killing style with practiced precision, right up until Zabuza trapped him inside a suffocating dome of compressed water, seemingly rendering him helpless. Your Sharingan can copy techniques, Zabuza said coldly, one clone holding the water prison steady while the real Zabuza advanced menacingly on the 3 frozen genin. But it can't help you if you're not free to use it. For one horrifying moment, it looked as though everything might collapse into disaster right then and there. 3 genin against a legendary rogue shinobi, their sensei trapped and helpless. But Sasuke, drawing on quick thinking and the tactical instincts that had made him top of their class, rallied Naruto and Sakura into a coordinated diversion, buying just enough time and just enough opening for Kakashi to break free using a substitution technique and turn the tide decisively back in their favor. Zabuza, badly wounded and outmaneuvered, was forced into a hasty retreat when a masked figure suddenly appeared and drove a set of Saban needles into his neck, apparently finishing the job before vanishing with the corpse, though Kakashi's exhausted, watchful expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that battle was truly over. Hunternin, he murmured, staring at the spot where the masked figure had vanished. Typically they dispose of bodies on the spot, rather than carrying them away for later disposal. Something about that felt wrong. He collapsed from chakra exhaustion moments later, and the weight of responsibility for getting their wounded sensei and shaken client safely to Tezuna's home fell, for the very first time, squarely onto 3 genin who suddenly understood, in a way no classroom lecture could ever have taught them, exactly how dangerous the real shinobi world truly was. The days that followed at Tezuna's modest home passed in a strange, tense limbo, Kakashi recovering from chakra exhaustion, the genin left largely to their own devices, and an undercurrent of quiet dread hanging over the entire household at the knowledge that Zabuza, Hunternin or no Hunternin, was very likely still alive somewhere out there. Naruto used the downtime to slip away quietly each morning, finding secluded patches of forest along the outskirts of Tazuna's property where he could continue his private training, carefully shaping small, controlled sprouts and root formations, pushing himself gradually towards slightly larger and more complex constructs while remaining acutely careful never to overextend himself into the kind of exhausting, uncontrolled surge that had marked his very first display back in that clearing. It was during one such session that Sasuke found him. What exactly? Sasuke said, arms crossed, leaning against a nearby tree with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something harder to name. Is that? Naruto froze, a half-formed sapling still clutched loosely between his palms. Roots halfway emerged from the disturbed soil beneath him. He hadn't heard Sasuke approach, too absorbed in his concentration to notice footsteps that, in hindsight, hadn't been particularly quiet at all. Naruto said eloquently, scrambling to think of an explanation that wouldn't violate Hiruzen's explicit instructions about secrecy. It's a new jutsu. I've been working on it. In secret. Because it's, super embarrassing if it doesn't work. Sasuke's dark eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unconvinced by the transparently weak excuse, though something in his expression suggested he was choosing, for now, not to push the issue further. That's not any jutsu I've ever seen in the academy curriculum, he said flatly. Or anywhere else, for that matter. Yeah, well, Naruto said, forcing an awkward laugh, scrambling upright and brushing dirt from his knees. Maybe I've got some secret techniques you don't know about, huh? Ever consider that? Something flickered behind Sasuke's expression, not quite anger, but something adjacent to it. A quiet, uncomfortable recognition that the gap between them, the one he'd always assumed ran firmly in his own favor, might not be nearly as fixed as he believed his entire life. Whatever, Sasuke muttered finally, turning to walk away. Just don't get yourself killed with whatever secret you're hiding, dead last. I'm not carrying your body home. He left without waiting for a response, and Naruto stared after him for a long moment, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. He didn't fully understand yet just how deeply that small exchange had planted a seed of quiet resentment in his teammate, a resentment that had nothing to do with malice, and everything to do with a boy who had spent his entire life defining himself as the strongest, suddenly forced to wonder whether that definition still held true. If you've ever watched someone start to feel threatened by a friend's growth instead of proud of it, you know exactly the kind of tension that's about to simmer beneath the surface for the rest of this arc. But don't worry, there's plenty more happening in Wave Country before we get there. Let's keep going. Kakashi's recovery brought with it a now familiar training regimen, tree climbing exercises designed to refine chakra control through precise, sustained application. Walking vertically up tree trunks using nothing but carefully regulated chakra flow to the soles of their feet. For Sakura, the exercise came almost effortlessly, her naturally refined chakra control allowing her to scale the tallest tree in the clearing on her very first attempt. For Sasuke and Naruto, it proved considerably more frustrating. For Naruto, though, something curious happened partway through the exercise. On his fourth failed attempt, frustration mounting, his chakra flared instinctively toward its more familiar dual nature, and for just a moment, thin tendrils of root wove briefly around his ankles as he fell, cushioning his landing far more gently than gravity alone should have allowed. Kakashi, watching from a short distance away, said nothing out loud, though the corner of his mask-covered mouth twitched with the faintest hint of a knowing smile. He's starting to integrate it almost unconsciously now, Kakashi thought, filing the observation away for his next private conversation with Hiruzen. That's going to make deliberate control considerably more complicated to teach, but it also means the ability itself is settling in deeper than any of us initially expected. Evenings at Tazuna's home brought their own quiet revelations. Inari, Tazuna's young grandson, watched the visiting shinobi with a mixture of resentment and buried grief, having lost his stepfather, a man the entire village had once looked to as a symbol of hope, to Gato's brutal cruelty. His bitterness boiled over one evening at dinner, a sharp, angry declaration that heroes didn't exist, that strength like theirs meant nothing against a man who could simply buy an army and crush anyone who dared to hope. Naruto, of all people, was the one who answered him, not with his usual loud bravado, but with something quieter and more genuine, drawing on his own hard-won understanding of what it meant to be dismissed and underestimated his entire life, only to discover that growth and change were possible even when the whole world insisted otherwise. You don't get to decide there's no such thing as heroes just because you've only ever seen bad things happen, Naruto said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even himself. I spent my whole life being told I was nothing. Every single day. And you know what? Maybe I still don't know exactly what I'm capable of, but I know I'm not gonna just accept that nothing's ever gonna change, just because it's easier to believe that than to actually try. Inari said nothing in response, storming off to his room, but something in his expression had shifted, just slightly, in a way that would matter far more than anyone at that table yet realized. The masked hunter Nin who had killed Zabuza, a quiet, gentle-spoken young man named Haku, found Naruto alone the following morning, gathering herbs in a secluded clearing not far from where Naruto had been continuing his own private training. Neither recognized the other's true significance in that first meeting. Haku appeared, to Naruto's eyes, simply as a soft-spoken village boy going about ordinary business, dressed modestly in a simple, high-neck tunic and long, practical trousers suited for outdoor work. Their conversation drifted, as such quiet conversations often do, toward questions of purpose and strength, Haku speaking with quiet, thoughtful conviction about the idea that true strength came from having someone precious to protect, rather than from raw power alone. When precious people are threatened, Haku said softly, watching Naruto's expression carefully, that's when a person can become truly strong. Stronger than they ever believed themselves capable of being. Naruto thought of Iruka, bleeding into the dirt of that clearing weeks ago. He thought of the sudden, overwhelming clarity of purpose that had torn roots up from solid earth in the space of a single desperate heartbeat. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I think I understand exactly what you mean. Neither of them yet knew they would be facing each other across a battlefield within days. Zabuza, as Kakashi had suspected all along, was very much alive, his wounds tended carefully by Haku while he recovered his strength for a second, decisive confrontation. When that confrontation finally came, it arrived at the half-finished bridge itself, thick fog rolling in once more as Zabuza and Haku emerged to block Team 7's path, backed by an entire private army of thugs hired by Gato to eliminate Tazuna once and for all. Round 2, Kakashi, Zabuza said, blade already unwrapped and gleaming even in the dim, fog-muted light. Let's see if your little genin have learned anything useful since our last encounter. Kakashi engaged Zabuza directly, Sharingan blazing, while Haku moved to intercept Sasuke and Naruto, forming a devastating technique that encircled them both within a dome of razor-sharp ice mirrors, each one reflecting Haku's image in dizzying, disorienting multiplication. I'm sorry, Haku said, voice still carrying that same quiet gentleness even in the midst of battle, Senbon needles flashing between reflections faster than either genin could fully track. But I cannot allow you to interfere. Zabuza's dream depends on this outcome. Sasuke, activating his Sharingan for the very first time under the extreme duress of the fight, managed to track and predict some of Haku's movements, but the sheer speed and coordination of the technique still overwhelmed him within minutes, Senbon needles finding their marks with increasingly precise, punishing accuracy. He collapsed, badly wounded, directly in front of Naruto, having thrown himself deliberately into the path of what looked like a killing strike aimed squarely at his teammate. Sasuke! Naruto's voice cracked, dropping to his knees beside his fallen teammate's unmoving body, a devastating cocktail of grief and fury boiling up inside him with an intensity he never experienced before. He's not dead, Haku said quietly from within the ice mirrors, an odd note of genuine regret coloring his voice. Merely unconscious from the toxin on my needles. I did not wish to kill either of you, if it could be avoided. But grief, in that moment, didn't listen to logic. Something inside Naruto, the same something that had torn roots from solid earth to protect Iruka weeks earlier, surged upward with a force he hadn't felt since that very first night, chakra flooding outward in a desperate, protective wave that even his careful weeks of training hadn't fully prepared him to control under this level of genuine emotional extremity. If you've made it this far, you already know this is the moment the entire story has been building toward. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now is absolutely the time, because what happens next changes the entire battlefield. The ground within the ice dome trembled violently, and thick, gnarled roots erupted from the frozen earth with astonishing speed, tearing directly through several of Haku's carefully constructed ice mirrors before the startled shinobi could react, shattering them into scattering, glittering fragments across the bridge. Haku staggered backward in genuine shock, staring at the sudden intrusion of dark, twisting wood amid the wreckage of his technique. That's impossible. That chakra signature. Naruto rose slowly to his feet, standing protectively over Sasuke's fallen body, both hands raised, chakra pouring from his palms in barely contained waves as a dense, curving wall of solid wood erupted from the ground around them both, forming a protective barrier that absorbed the next volley of Saban needles with a series of dull, solid thuds rather than the piercing impacts Haku's technique was designed to deliver. "You're not touching him again," Naruto said, voice low and dangerous in a way that startled even himself, echoing almost word for word the same declaration he'd made against Mizuki weeks earlier. Haku's eyes widened behind his mask, clearly recognizing, on some instinctive level, exactly what kind of rare and precious ability he was now facing, even without knowing its full history or significance. "That technique? Where did you learn something like that?" "Doesn't matter," Naruto growled, pushing himself upright despite the visible strain the sudden, extended output was placing on his still-developing control. Sweat poured down his face, his hands trembling with the effort of maintaining the barrier while simultaneously trying to keep his own chakra from spiraling back into the same uncontrolled chaos that had marked his very first display. "What matters is you're not getting anywhere near my friend." He pushed forward, wooden barrier expanding and reshaping itself around him in rough, jagged formations far less refined than his careful weeks of training had produced, but undeniably, desperately effective, forcing Haku back step by step, disrupting the remaining ice mirrors one by one until the dome's structural integrity finally collapsed entirely. Haku, staggering backward from the disorienting collapse of his own technique, found himself cornered, Saban spent, chakra reserves critically depleted from maintaining such an advanced jutsu for so long. He looked up to see Naruto standing over him, chakra visibly guttering and unstable, clearly on the very edge of his own physical limits, and yet not backing down an inch. "Why?" Haku asked quietly, genuine confusion coloring his voice even in defeat. "Do you fight so hard for someone who seems to resent you?" Naruto glanced back at Sasuke's unconscious form, then back at Haku, chest heaving with exhaustion. "Because that's what precious people are for. You said it yourself, right? Guess I finally get what you meant." Before either of them could say anything further, a sudden, sharp cry rang out from across the bridge. Kakashi, locked in a brutal exchange with Zabuza, had just been forced into a position where victory seemed suddenly, genuinely within reach, his Sharingan having finally decoded the full pattern of Zabuza's silent killing technique. Haku's expression shifted instantly from quiet defeat to desperate urgency. "Zabuza-sama needs me." He vanished in a burst of speed Naruto's exhausted body had no hope of intercepting, racing to intervene just as Kakashi's blade found what should have been a killing strike against Zabuza, only for Haku to throw himself directly into its path instead, sacrificing himself in his master's place with the same quiet, unwavering devotion that had defined every choice he'd made throughout the entire battle. The bridge fell silent, save for the distant crash of waves and Zabuza's ragged, disbelieving breathing as he stared down at the fallen boy who had given everything for him. What followed was a reckoning decades in the making, Gato himself arriving with his mercenary army, intending to betray Zabuza entirely now that the missing Nin's usefulness had run its course, mocking Haku's sacrifice with casual, contemptuous cruelty that finally shattered whatever cold detachment Zabuza had maintained throughout his mercenary career. Zabuza, badly wounded and grieving in his own quiet, complicated way, turned on Gato's forces with a fury that needed no further motivation than simple, righteous vengeance, cutting a devastating path directly toward the man who treated Haku's sacrifice as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He fell in that final confrontation, but not before ensuring Gato himself would never threaten Wave Country again. The remaining mercenaries, faced with their employer's death and Zabuza's terrifying, unrestrained final assault, scattered in disorganized retreat, until the villagers of Wave themselves, emboldened by weeks of quiet hope kindled by Tezuna's stubborn determination and, in no small part, by Inari's own change of heart following his conversation with Naruto, arrived en masse to reinforce Team 7's position, driving the remaining threat away entirely. By the time the fighting had fully ceased, Naruto found himself sitting exhausted on the edge of the unfinished bridge, chakra reserves scraped nearly to empty, watching medics tend to Sasuke's recovering form nearby while villagers began the slow, hopeful work of clearing away the debris of battle. Sasuke stirred awake just as the sun broke fully through the retreating morning fog, blinking groggily up at Naruto's exhausted but relieved face. "You're alive?" Sasuke muttered, voice still rough from the toxin's lingering effects. "Yeah, no thanks to you throwing yourself in front of Saban needles like some kind of idiot," Naruto shot back, though the words came out with far more warmth than actual accusation. Sasuke studied him for a long, quiet moment, taking in the scattered remnants of wood and roots still visible across the bridge's surface, evidence of whatever had happened while he'd been unconscious. "What exactly did I miss?" Naruto hesitated, glancing briefly toward Kakashi, who offered the barest, almost imperceptible nod of permission from a short distance away. "I'll explain everything eventually," Naruto said finally, exhaustion softening the usual bravado in his voice into something quieter and more genuine. "Just trust me a little longer, okay? It's not something I can talk about yet. But I promise, when the time's right, you'll understand." Sasuke's dark eyes lingered on him for a long moment, an unreadable mixture of curiosity, wariness, and something that might, with enough time, eventually grow into genuine respect. "Fine," he said finally, closing his eyes again. "But you owe me an explanation dead last. Don't think I'll forget." If you've been enjoying this story, make sure to leave a comment letting us know what you think Sasuke's reaction is really going to be once he learns the full truth, because trust me, it's not going to be as simple as either of them expects. The bridge was completed within weeks, its construction bolstered by newfound hope and cooperation from villagers who finally believed, for the first time in years, that a better future was actually possible. Tazuna, in a moment of characteristic bluntness mixed with genuine gratitude, insisted the bridge be named in honor of the shinobi who had helped restore that hope, settling, after considerable debate, on a name intended to honor the Great Ninja Bridge, a tribute to the entire team's sacrifice rather than any single individual. As Team 7 finally prepared to depart for home, Inori stood at the edge of the village alongside his mother and grandfather, doing his level best to maintain a stoic, unaffected expression that crumbled almost immediately the moment Naruto turned to wave farewell. "Hey," Naruto called back, grinning despite his own lingering exhaustion, "don't go getting all soft on me now. Next time I visit, I expect this whole village to be thriving, got it?" Inori nodded fiercely, swiping at his eyes with obvious embarrassment, and Naruto's grin only widened in response. The journey back toward Konoha passed in comfortable, contented quiet, Sakura chattering excitedly about everything they need to report to Hiruzen. Sasuke walking in his usual reserved silence, though his occasional glances toward Naruto now carried a weight of genuine reconsideration rather than simple dismissal. Kakashi, walking a short distance behind his 3 genin, found himself reflecting quietly on everything he'd witnessed throughout the mission, the raw, desperate power Naruto had displayed in defense of his teammate, the visible physical toll such an extended, high-stakes deployment of his still-developing ability had clearly taken, and the delicate, complicated question of how much longer such a secret could realistically remain contained within their small circle. "He's growing faster than anyone anticipated," Kakashi thought, watching Naruto stumble slightly from lingering exhaustion before catching himself with stubborn determination. But growth this rapid, under this much pressure, carries its own risks. We need to be more deliberate about his training from here forward, for his own sake, as much as anyone else's. Back in Konoha, Hiruzen listened to Kakashi's full mission report with the careful, measured attention of a man weighing consequences several steps beyond the immediate moment. "He used it in direct, sustained combat," Hiruzen said slowly, once Kakashi had finished. "Against a trained hunter nin, no less." "He had little choice, given the circumstances," Kakashi replied evenly. "But Hokage-sama, I'll be blunt. The strain visibly exceeded anything his current training has prepared him to handle safely. If similar circumstances arise again before his control has matured further, the risk to his own well-being becomes considerably more serious." Hiruzen nodded slowly, already turning over the implications in his mind. "Then we accelerate his training accordingly. Carefully, but more intensively than before. It seems clear now that circumstance will not always wait patiently for his growth to catch up on its own timeline." He glanced toward the window, gazing out over the village bathed in early evening light, thinking of a boy who had left for his very first mission still uncertain of his own capabilities, and returned carrying proof, however exhausting and imperfect, that the legacy stirring inside him was very much alive, and very much ready to keep growing whether anyone felt fully prepared for it or not. "Send Naruto to me first thing tomorrow morning," Hiruzen said finally. "It's time we began training in earnest." Word travels strangely in the shinobi world. It doesn't move through official channels or formal reports, not at first. It moves through the quiet, half-whispered conversations of merchants who happened to pass through Wave Country during its reconstruction. It moves through the mouths of sailors who'd heard, secondhand, about a bridge finished ahead of schedule thanks to intervention from a group of Konoha shinobi. And eventually, inevitably, it moves through the ears of people whose job it is to listen very, very carefully to rumors like that. By the time Team 7 stood in line to submit their Chunin exam applications back in Konoha, a version of what happened on that bridge, distorted, exaggerated, missing crucial details but unmistakably rooted in truth, had already reached villages considerably farther away than anyone back home would have preferred. None of that mattered yet to Naruto, standing in the crowded hallway outside the exam building, practically buzzing with restless energy. "Chunin exams," he said for what had to be the 10th time that morning, grinning ear to ear. "We're actually doing this. This is it, guys. This is where I prove I'm not just some dead last." "We get it," Sasuke cut in, though there was noticeably less bite in the words than there might have been a month ago. The three of them made their way up the stairs toward the designated exam room, only to find their path blocked by a small crowd of nervous-looking genin gathered outside a door marked with a large 301, except, as Sakura quickly pointed out with a raised eyebrow, they were only on the second floor. A genjutsu, poorly disguised, meant to weed out anyone too inattentive to notice the discrepancy. Two older-looking genin stood guard at the fake door, apparently enjoying the opportunity to rough up the more anxious examinees under the pretense of toughening them up before the real test even began. It was Rock Lee, a green-clad genin from Konoha's own ranks, who intervened before things escalated too far, challenging Sasuke to a spontaneous fight after the illusion had been exposed and the fake exam room revealed for what it was, driven by an intense, almost startling admiration for Sasuke's clan reputation. The brief exchange ended in Lee's favor through sheer speed and technique, a humbling wake-up call for Sasuke that plenty of genin outside Konoha's own graduating class had trained just as hard, if not harder, for this moment. But it was the quiet, unassuming boy standing near the back of the crowd who caught the most attention, not from noise or confrontation, but from something far stranger. Naruto felt it before he consciously understood why. A cold, heavy pressure settled over the hallway the moment he glanced toward a red-headed boy leaning silently against the far wall, gourd strapped to his back, dark rings circling unblinking eyes that seemed to carry a weight far beyond his apparent age. The boy's gaze flicked toward Naruto and lingered there, something unreadable passing behind those pale, tired eyes. "Mother wants his blood," a voice murmured somewhere deep inside Gaara's own mind, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, that ever-present, bloodthirsty whisper hesitated, uncertain, as though sensing something it couldn't quite name. Gaara said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Naruto standing there with an inexplicable chill crawling up his spine, unable to explain exactly why that brief, silent exchange had unsettled him so deeply. "You okay?" Sakura asked, noticing Naruto's unusually quiet expression. "Yeah," Naruto said, shaking off the strange feeling with visible effort. "Just, that guy gives me the creeps." If you've ever taken a test where the real challenge wasn't the questions themselves, you already know exactly what's coming. Because the first stage of the Chunin exams isn't testing knowledge at all, it's testing something far more important. Stick around, because this part of the story rewards paying close attention. The written exam took place in a large, tense room presided over by a scarred, intimidating proctor named Ibiki Marino, whose reputation for psychological warfare preceded him considerably. The test itself, as Naruto and dozens of other genin would soon discover, was less about the 10 deliberately impossible questions printed on the page and more about a genin's willingness to gather information by any means necessary, cheating cleverly enough not to get caught. Precisely the kind of resourcefulness expected of a competent Chunin operating behind enemy lines. Naruto, characteristically, understood none of this subtlety at first, staring in mounting panic at a question sheet that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Sakura, working quietly and carefully beside him, managed to gather answers through legitimate deduction and careful, disguised glances at surrounding papers, occasionally passing along subtle hints to her teammates without drawing the proctor's attention. It was the 10th and final question, however, that revealed the test's true nature, an all-or-nothing gamble that would cost each team member every point they'd accumulated if they chose incorrectly, framed explicitly as a test of courage rather than knowledge. Team after team folded under the pressure, choosing to withdraw rather than risk everything on an unknown outcome. Naruto's hand trembled as he considered raising it to withdraw, weeks of academy failures and self-doubt creeping back in at the worst possible moment. But then he thought of that clearing, of the moment he'd stood his ground against Mizuki with nothing but stubborn resolve to guide him, and something steadied inside him. "I'm not backing down," he announced loudly, slamming his hand down onto the desk hard enough to rattle the surrounding tables, drawing every eye in the room toward him. "Even if I end up a genin forever, I'm not gonna run from a stupid question just because it might make me look bad. Bring it on." His declaration, delivered with characteristic loud, reckless conviction, ended up tipping the scales for dozens of other wavering genin throughout the room, several of whom found their own courage bolstered enough to stay rather than withdraw. Ibiki, watching this ripple effect with a carefully hidden note of genuine approval, ultimately revealed there had never been a real 10th question at all. The entire exercise designed purely to test whether examinees possessed the courage to make difficult decisions under uncertain, high-stakes pressure. Just as the passing teams began their relieved celebrations, a violent crash tore through the far window, and a wild, dramatic kunoichi wrapped in a dark cloak announced herself as the proctor for the exam's second stage, promising to cut the number of remaining teams in half before it was over. The Forest of Death lived up to its ominous reputation immediately. Team 7 entered the dense, oppressive forest tasked with a simple but brutal objective: survive 5 days while securing both a heaven and an earth scroll from rival teams, then reach the central tower before time expired. It didn't take long for trouble to find them. A team of sound-affiliated genin, apparently harboring a personal grudge against Sasuke stemming from his clan's reputation, ambushed Team 7 with a coordinated assault clearly designed to isolate and eliminate him specifically, using a bizarre sound-based technique that induced disorientation and nausea in anyone caught within its range. Naruto, momentarily separated from his teammates and disoriented by the technique's effects, found himself face to face with one of the sound genin, a girl wielding senbon coated in some manner of debilitating poison, sneering with open contempt at what she assumed was an easy target. "The famous Konoha genin," she said mockingly, twirling a senbon between her fingers. "I expected more, honestly." Naruto, remembering Hiruzen's careful instructions about restraint and discretion, tried initially to handle the confrontation using ordinary taijutsu and a handful of shadow clones, a technique he'd finally mastered properly weeks ago, thanks in part to the same chakra control refinement his private training had demanded. But the girl's poison-laced senbon found their mark before he could fully press his advantage, and as his vision began to blur dangerously at the edges, old instinct reasserted itself. Thin roots erupted from the forest floor beneath her feet before he'd even consciously decided to use them, wrapping around her ankles and yanking her off balance long enough for Naruto to close the distance and end the confrontation with a solid, decisive strike. He caught himself immediately afterward, staring down at the retreating roots with a flash of genuine alarm. "Careful," he reminded himself, forcing his racing pulse to steady. "Old man said keep it subtle. Not everyone needs to see everything." Fortunately, the girl was too disoriented from her own defeat and the ambient poison symptoms clouding Naruto's own vision to fully register or later accurately describe exactly what had happened to her. By the time Team 7 regrouped and the sound team retreated, only the faintest, easily dismissed rumor of some kind of trap jutsu would eventually filter back through second-hand accounts. Nothing concrete enough to draw serious scrutiny, at least for now. Sasuke, watching quietly from a short distance away after the confrontation, said nothing directly, though his expression carried the unmistakable weight of a boy piecing together a puzzle whose picture was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. If you're enjoying this story, drop a comment telling us how you think Sasuke is going to react once the full truth finally comes out, because trust me, We're getting closer to that moment with every passing chapter. Now, let's talk about the encounter nobody saw coming. It happened on the third day, deep within the forest's oppressive canopy, when Team 7 stumbled directly into the path of Gaara's own team from Sunagakure. The confrontation began almost accidentally, a territorial dispute over a contested scroll that quickly escalated far beyond what either side had initially intended. Gaara's siblings, a sharp-tongued kunoichi named Temari and a puppet-wielding genin named Kankuro, moved to intervene before things turned openly violent, clearly wary of provoking their own teammates' temper unnecessarily. But Gaara himself stepped forward regardless, that same cold, unreadable weight settling over the clearing the moment his eyes fixed on Naruto specifically, ignoring Sasuke and Sakura almost entirely. "You," Gaara said quietly, voice carrying none of the theatrical menace Naruto might have expected from a genin with such an intimidating reputation, and all the more unsettling for its flat, genuine curiosity. "There's something different about you. Something Mother wants." Naruto said, immediately on guard. "Yeah, I'm gonna need you to explain." Literally none of that made sense. Sand began shifting restlessly around Gaara's feet, coiling and uncoiling like something alive and hungry, and the ambient temperature of the clearing seemed to drop several degrees despite the humid forest air. "Existence is proven through killing," Gaara continued, almost conversationally, "and I've killed countless people already to prove my own. But you..." His pale eyes narrowed slightly. "Whatever you're hiding beneath the surface, I want to see it." Sasuke moved instinctively to put himself between Naruto and the increasingly unstable sand, Sharingan already flickering to life in his eyes, while Sakura ready to kunai with visibly trembling hands. "Back off," Sasuke said sharply. "Whatever you're planning, it's not happening today." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved, the clearing thick with a silence that felt like it might shatter into violence at any second. Then, unexpectedly, Gaara simply stepped back, the restless sand settling once more into stillness around his feet. "Not yet," he said, almost to himself, turning away with the same eerie calm he'd arrived with. "But soon. I want to see what you truly are, Konoha Genin. And I will." He vanished into the forest canopy with his visibly relieved siblings trailing behind him, leaving Team 7 standing in stunned, uneasy silence. "What," Sakura finally managed, voice unsteady, "was that?" "I don't know," Naruto admitted, staring after the direction Gaara had disappeared. "But whatever it is, I don't think we've seen the last of it." He was right, though even he couldn't have guessed just how soon, or how violently, that particular thread would come back around. The remaining days in the forest passed with grim, exhausting efficiency, Team 7 eventually securing both required scrolls through a combination of careful strategy, Sakura's quick thinking, and one particularly memorable moment where Naruto, cornered by a hostile team attempting to steal their scroll outright, produced a defensive lattice of interwoven roots dense enough to physically block an entire volley of thrown kunai. He kept the display brief and controlled this time, mindful of Hiruzen's lessons, retracting the wooden barrier back into the earth the moment the immediate threat passed rather than allowing it to linger as visible evidence. Still, word of that Konoha kid with the weird trap technique continued its slow, quiet spread among the surviving genin teams, a rumor gathering just enough substance to eventually reach ears far more dangerous than Naruto could have anticipated. By the time Team 7 finally emerged at the central tower, exhausted but triumphant, having secured both scrolls with 2 full days to spare, all 3 genin had changed in ways that went considerably deeper than physical exhaustion. Sakura had discovered a genuine reserve of tactical sharpness beneath her earlier nervousness. Sasuke had confronted, uncomfortably, the reality that his own considerable talent didn't automatically place him at the top of every possible hierarchy. And Naruto had learned, through hard, careful practice under real pressure, just how much control he'd already developed, and just how much further he still needed to go. The preliminary round, held immediately once all qualifying teams had gathered at the tower, arrived with little warning and even less ceremony. An enormous digital scoreboard mounted on the wall would determine matchups randomly, pitting the surviving genin against one another in individual one-on-one combat to further thin the field before the exam's final, public tournament stage. The third Hokage himself addressed the assembled genin briefly before the preliminaries began, explaining with characteristic gravity the true purpose behind the Chunin exams, not merely a test of individual skill, but a carefully calibrated demonstration of village strength intended to maintain delicate diplomatic balance among the shinobi nations. Naruto, standing near the back of the assembled crowd, caught Hiruzen's gaze briefly across the room, receiving the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of quiet acknowledgement. Careful now, that small gesture seemed to say. You've done well to keep things contained this far. Stay disciplined. Naruto nodded back, just as subtly, understanding the unspoken message completely. The first several preliminary matches played out with the expected mix of skill and unpredictability. Sasuke's ally-turn-rival dynamic with several other examinees played out in the background while Naruto watched carefully from the sidelines, trying to gauge exactly what level of skill he was truly up against. It was Sakura's own preliminary match, pitted unexpectedly against another kunoichi with equally sharp tactical instincts, that ended in a rare double forfeit when both girls, exhausted and evenly matched, collapsed simultaneously from chakra depletion after an intense, grueling exchange that left the entire crowd genuinely impressed. Sasuke's own match came next, pitted against a genin wielding a bizarre bug-based technique that drained chakra on contact. Despite a difficult, close-fought battle that pushed his growing Sharingan abilities to their current limit, Sasuke ultimately secured a hard-won victory, collapsing afterward from the cumulative strain of both the forest ordeal and the fight itself, requiring urgent medical attention that would keep him out of active training for the following month. A complication that would matter considerably more in the weeks ahead than anyone realized in that immediate moment. Then came Naruto's turn. The digital scoreboard flickered and cycled through names with theatrical randomness before finally settling, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd as the two names locked into place. Uzumaki Naruto vs. Hyuga Neji. If you've been waiting for this exact matchup since the beginning of this arc, you already know exactly why this is such a big deal. And if you don't yet, trust me, by the end of the next chapter you will. Murmurs rippled through the assembled genin and observing jonin alike. Neji Hyuga's reputation preceded him considerably, widely regarded as the single most talented genin in his entire graduating class, wielder of the Byakugan, and possessor of a taijutsu style so precise and devastating that few genin his age could hope to stand against it for more than a few exchanges. Neji himself descended the stairs toward the arena floor with an air of cold, unshakable confidence, pale, unblinking eyes fixed on Naruto with something that bordered on open condescension. So, Neji said, voice carrying easily across the now quiet arena floor, the so-called dead last of his graduating class. I'd heard rumors about some unusual incident in Wave Country, but I confess I remain skeptical there's anything genuinely noteworthy hiding beneath your reputation. Naruto stepped down to meet him, jaw set with quiet, stubborn resolve. He'd heard plenty of dismissive words in his life. This one landed no differently than all the others, which was to say, it landed exactly hard enough to fuel the fire already building steadily in his chest. Funny, Naruto said, rolling his shoulders loosely, everyone always seems real confident right before they find out otherwise. Neji's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Confidence isn't the issue here. Fate is. Some individuals are simply born into circumstances destined for greatness, Naruto Uzumaki. Others are born destined only to fail, regardless of how much effort they pour into changing that outcome. I've watched enough of both in my life to recognize the difference at a glance. You are unmistakably the latter. Something in Naruto's chest tightened at those words, not from doubt, exactly, but from the sudden, sharp memory of years spent hearing some version of that exact sentiment from nearly everyone he'd ever known. And yet, standing there now, with weeks of hard-won training and genuine growth behind him, the words simply didn't land the way they might have a few months earlier. You know, Naruto said slowly, an unfamiliar calm settling over him even as his fists clenched at his sides. I used to believe stuff like that too, that maybe I really was just destined to be nothing, no matter how hard I tried. But you know what I figured out? Fate's only real if you let it be. And I've got a lot of practice by now proving people wrong about what I'm supposedly destined for. The proctor overseeing the match, a perpetually exhausted-looking jonin named Genma, glanced between the two combatants, sensing the genuine weight behind that exchange, and raised a hand to signal the official start. Begin, he said simply, stepping back to give them room. Neji moved first, Byakugan already fully active, veins bulging faintly around his temples as his vision sharpened into its terrifyingly precise, all-seeing state. He closed the distance in a blur of controlled, economical motion, striking with the opening sequence of his family's signature gentle fist style, a technique designed not merely to injure, but to systematically shut down an opponent's chakra pathways with surgical, merciless precision. Naruto barely managed to avoid the first strike, feeling the air displace past his ribs close enough to know exactly how dangerous a direct hit would have been. He countered with a burst of shadow clones, hoping to overwhelm Niji's field of vision with sheer numbers, a strategy that had worked reasonably well against less perceptive opponents. Against the Byakugan, it failed almost instantly. "Your clones carry no genuine presence," Niji said coldly, dispatching 3 of them in rapid succession with brutally efficient strikes, each blow finding its mark with unnerving, almost casual precision. "I can see directly through every one of your tricks before you've even fully committed to them." Naruto stumbled backward, already breathing harder than he'd have liked, genuinely impressed and more than a little unnerved by the sheer gap in raw technical precision separating them. Niji pressed his advantage immediately, closing the distance again with terrifying speed, palm strikes flashing out in rapid, calculated succession. Naruto took several solid hits before he managed to create enough distance to reassess, one arm already going faintly numb from a chakra-disrupting strike that had found its mark despite his best efforts to avoid it. "He's not wrong about the gap," Naruto admitted to himself, forcing his ragged breathing back under control. "Taijutsu alone isn't gonna cut it here. Not against someone this precise." He thought back to Hiruzen's careful, repeated lessons about discretion, about keeping this ability contained, subtle, hidden from unnecessary eyes whenever possible. But he thought, too, of the old man's other lesson, the one about purpose and control mattering more than raw power alone. "Guess it's time to actually use what I've been training for," Naruto decided, steadying himself. Carefully. Smart. Not like some wild, out-of-control mess. On purpose this time, he planted his feet firmly against the arena floor, closing his eyes for just a fraction of a second, drawing on the same deliberate, focused calm Hiruzen had spent weeks carefully teaching him to access. Niji, watching this brief pause with open, faintly contemptuous curiosity, prepared to press his advantage once more. "Giving up already? I'd hoped for at least a slightly more interesting match." "Not giving up," Naruto said quietly, opening his eyes again, something new and steady burning behind them. "Just getting started." The arena floor beneath his feet trembled, faint cracks spreading outward from where he stood, and for the first time since the fight began, genuine uncertainty flickered across Niji's carefully composed expression.